a little bit after 10 o'clock, so we'll make a start. My name is Sean Cooper. I'm the lead analyst on the MHHS design team, and I want to thank you for joining us this morning for what I think is the third end-to-end walkthrough that we've been running over the last couple of weeks, where we walk through in a bit more detail the MHHS design, and the areas that we're going to be focusing on today is our MPAN ownership. Hopefully you can all see my screen. What we'll do is flick between the PowerPoint deck that we've got, and obviously the business process maps. I think going to be supported today by a couple of colleagues. Alyssa Prislak, who's also a BA on the design team, and also a couple of colleagues from the PPC, Amity and Marina. I think what we'd like to do, if we can, is we've got quite a lot to get through. We've got quite a lot to get through today. So what we'd like to do is plough through as much of the content as we can, and then look to take questions collectively at the end. But I think as with the other sessions, if you have got questions or queries as we're going through, if you could raise those on Slido with the hashtag MHHS, those will go through to the guys, and hopefully then by the end of the session we'll have a good idea of what the most popular or most common questions are, and then we can pick those up at the end of the session. I think as well, we're just our recording started. Great, just wanted to check. So just to let everyone know, we're recording this session. So yeah, as I said, we've got quite a bit of material to get through today. Just quickly running through the agenda. Just wanted to quickly flash up the target operating model on the screen. I don't plan on dwelling on that an awful lot because I think it's been covered in the earlier sessions. But I think what we did want to call out was perhaps the role the registration service plays in the target operating model, which perhaps I don't think had necessarily been dwelt on in the previous sessions. And then we'll actually walk through some of the processes that we've sort of gathered together under the banner of MPAN ownership, which is the change of supplier process, new connections process, change of service provider, which is AKA change of agent as we know it today. Then have a brief conversation around the way in which linked MPANs or grouped MPANs are treated with respect to change of service provider and service provider appointment. We'll then have a look at the exchange of reads process. So how readings are exchanged between participants following a cause, and then wrapping up with supplier updates to the registration service or the registration system. The way we plan on doing it today is effectively we've got a sort of cut a slide or two for each of these processes or each of these areas, and really what the slide is attempting to do is to just give a high level kind of headline view of the changes or how the process will operate, just to give us a bit of a starter for 10 before we look at the process maps. I think Alyssa and myself coming back at looking at the process maps 3 or 4 weeks on, is sometimes a little bit daunting. So hopefully having a little bit of a kind of preamble before we throw the maps up on the screen will help everyone's understanding. Then we'll actually walk through the processes in a little bit more detail, and as we said, plan will be to take Slido questions collectively at the end. So again, just to remind everyone, you can do that on the Slido website using the MHHS hashtag. Depending on how we go for time, we might take a little 5-minute breather around the kind of 1 hour mark just to give my voice a rest. But we'll play that by ear depending on how much progress we're making with the material, if that's all right. So, as I said, I think hopefully everyone's familiar with the MHHS target operating model now. I know it's been discussed in detail in the sort of kickoff in the design fundamentals sort of session, and I know colleague Kevin Spencer has talked through this in a number of the other sessions. I think, like I say, I wasn't planning on dwelling on it an awful lot, other than to perhaps just call out, I think, the central role that the registration service sort of now plays in terms of its role as the kind of system of record, if you like, in terms of both MPAN ownership, obviously, but what service providers are appointed or not appointed, what metering equipment is or isn't recorded at site. I think obviously we're all familiar with the registration service sort of holding a lot of that data currently. But in the MHHS world, it does it plays an even more significant role, and effectively, all participants should effectively take the view that whatever registration services, whatever exists in the registration service is de facto the data that will be used until such time as it's corrected or updated. So it really does become the kind of data hub, if you like, for all the participants. So that's all I wanted to. I think that's what I wanted to call out. Really, was like I say, the key role the registration service has now in sort of being the system of record, if you like. I think I think you'll have perhaps seen these slides, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at the actual artifacts that were published last week. We weren't planning on spending a huge amount of time going through the detail of each individual interface and the data items in each interface, because I'm not sure we're going to have the time today. So this was really just to direct you to the interface document that's been published on the collaboration base and on the website, and that effectively consists of an interface list, if you like, of all of the MHHS interfaces, and then a kind of detailed breakdown of all of the data items that are contained in interfaces, and for some of the interfaces, but not all. There's actually a JSON, an example of the actual the physical message. I think the plan is to sort of publish a second iteration of this in the coming weeks that will have this JSON, the JSON examples populated for all of the interfaces. But I think it is only a couple at the moment. I think as well, I just wanted to, we'll share this pack and the link, but I also just wanted to call out a session that we did really as part of the closeout of the working groups, rather than as this latest sort of round of engagement. But there is a video on the SharePoint, on the program SharePoint site. It's about an hour long, where we do actually talk about how the interfaces will work from a API connectivity perspective, and some of the principles and rationale behind how the interfaces are sort of constructed. So again, it's about an hour long. If you do have some spare time, I think it would be well worth your time having a look at that. So if we start with the first of our processes for today, which is change of supplier, I think, as you'll all be aware, in recent weeks there's been sort of pretty fundamental change in the way in which the industry deals with this, with the go live of CSS, and I think that's the main thing that we wanted to call out, really, when it comes to change of supplier and a market-wide half-hourly, is that actually there isn't a huge amount to talk about, because the CSS manages the vast majority of those processes. I think the touch points that we would call out are that within the current design, upon acceptance of a switch request with CSS, the registration service is aware of updates that are happening in CSS through the ERDA interfaces. So effectively on creation of a new switch request, the registration service would issue a message, and again, I don't know the sort of convention in terms of interfaces and publications. I think again, I don't know whether this has been touched on in previous sessions, but as a kind of rule of thumb, they always come in pairs, and effectively the interface is the flow into the dip, and the publication is the flow out of the dip. So in this scenario, the registration service would be firing off an interface 02, and the supplier would be receiving the publication side of that, a pub 02. And upon initial acceptance of a registration a switch request, the registration service will send out that interface, and this contains the effectively the metering information, or the information that the supplier would need in order to do service provider determination. So, what metering, or what's the characteristics of the site, so as to allow him to decide what were the correct agents to appoint. So we've tried to avoid sort of drawing direct comparisons with the current process, but I guess it would be akin to the 217 today, I guess. I think we just wanted to call out at this point that we are aware that there is a rec change request going through, change 40, which looks to change and tweak some of the updates that the registration service will get. But I think certainly at the moment, following conversations with St. Clement's and the guys at the rec, I think the expectation is that the solution that's arrived at out of the conversations around this change request will still support this with this type of process. Obviously, depending on the exact solution that change comes up, settles upon, we may have to review the current design, but certainly I think the expectation at the moment is that R40 will deliver a solution that sort of works with the way in which we've currently got the process mapped out. Yeah, and then once that switch is successfully completed in CSS, then again CSS will update the registration service with the secured active, and that would then trigger the registration service to fire off a pub 01, interface 01 or pub 01 to the incoming supplier. And that's really just to confirm that from a MHHS world or a settlements perspective and a DIP perspective, that those parties are aware that, you know, yes, we acknowledge that you're now the new supplier, and it would also update Alexon Central Systems and LDSOs with notification of that successful change of supplier. So I think at this point, I think it's probably the time to dive into the process maps, and I'll ask if I can change screen. There we go. And I'll ask my colleague Alyssa to talk us through the process map. I think again, all these process maps are now published up on the collaboration base or the MHHS website. They all follow a similar sort of pattern. So hopefully, well, I'm sure if you're not already, then you'll become mega familiar with these over the coming weeks and months. So, are you all right to talk us through this one, Alyssa?
Yeah. Are you able to zoom in a little bit, please, Sean?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So the blue box here is to denote that this is the existing CSS quicker switching process, and as we don't plan to change that, we've just sort of highlighted that these are the activities that are going on. Once supplier has requested once the supplier has requested supply, the CSS will notify registrations that a COS status is pending, and they will provide, could you scroll down a little bit, Sean? Sorry. Thank you. They will provide the site information to the supplier on interface 2 and pub 02 via the DIP, so the supplier can then start the service provider appointments. They'll be able to identify which service providers need to be appointed, and that leads into the change of service provider business process maps. Once COS is secured, CSS will notify supply and registrations that the COS has got secured. Registrations will then send a notification to the DIP via, to supply to the LDSOs and to central settlements via the DIP on pub 01. If you could scroll to the top, Sean. Thank you. And once supply receives the CSS secured notification, the agent appointment process will be completed and they will be able to go into the read transfer for the change of supply.
Cheers, Alyssa. So as you can see from an MHHS perspective, I mean, it is a relatively it's a relatively straightforward and simple process. Two touch points. One, when the switch is first initiated, to send that metering information to allow for agent determination, and then secondly, as a kind of belt and braces confirmation to the supplier that the MHHS world is aware that the COS has happened, and then just to let other MHHS parties know as well. So hopefully that's relatively straightforward. We'll come on to talk in a bit more detail later on about the actual change of or appointment of service providers. Get my screens right. There we go. Okay. So the next process we were going to look at is new connections, and we've kind of added that here because it's not hugely dissimilar to the change of supplier process, and I think it will largely largely operating in the same way as it does today. MPAN creation is sort of requested and managed via the LDSO in the first instance, and then the LDSO creating that MPAN in CSS. Exactly the same as today. Key characteristics of the MPAN would be set at the point of creation by the LDSO, obviously informed by the supplier request in terms of the energy direction. Is it import export? Is it linked to any other MPANs? And also at this point, the supplier would have to sort of nominate the connection type, which is effectively a kind of describes the nature of the connection, the physical connection. So that would be either a whole current or LVCT, HVCT. So it's just the connection type is effectively describing the physical connection, and then the market segment. As we talked about has been talked about in the TOM, 3 market segments: the sort of smart traditional segment, the advanced segment, and then the unmetered supply segment. The MPAN would undergo initial registration via CSS triggered by the supplier, exactly the same as is the case today. And then supplier would initiate service provider appointments. Come on to that in a little bit. And then following on from that, you'd arrange your site works and your metering activity. And I suppose just to call out that there's another one of these sessions covering metering related updates that Alyssa and I will be running on. That's on Friday morning at 10 a.m. So we'll cover a lot more of the meter install, meter exchange, and all of the kind of metering status processes as part of that session on Friday. But if we switch back again, we can have a look at the actual physical process. So do you want to walk us through this one, Alyssa?
Yeah, if you could zoom in a little bit, please, Sean.
Yeah. So tell me when.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. So as per the previous process map, we've just highlighted the steps that are going on within CSS, but we've just boxed them off because we're not actually changing any of the process for that. So once supply has received the initial registration secured notification from CSS, they would then go into again BPO2 and BPO3 to appoint the relevant service providers. And once that activity is complete, if you could move to the just a little bit, thank you. They would then go into any kind of metering works that needed to be completed. CSS will also notify the registration service, who will then notify via the DIP the LDSOs and supply, just to confirm that everybody's been informed, and also central settlements. Just again, so every supplier is fully aware that everybody knows who supplier is and that it's all set up correctly for settlements. If you could scroll down, please, Sean. For unmetered supplies, so unmetered supplies will put requests into the LDSOs to set up MPAN creation, and they will be notified back from LDSOs that what the energisation status is and the effective from date once the MPAN's created. If the energisation status hasn't changed, then they will go into our data collection processes. And if the energisation status has changed, they need to then follow the change of energisation process map.
Cool.
I think that's the process. Yeah.
So again, hopefully, relatively, hopefully processes you're all sort of relatively familiar with, and let's say very, very similar to the standard changes to the supplier, process. Okay. So the next process we wanted to talk through was the change of service provider, change of agent or agent appointment as we would know it today. I think there's some. I think just to talk through some of the principles. I think whilst the process is obviously going to be somewhat different, there's actually the key facets of it sort of remain the same, in that the service provider appointment process is initiated. It's initiated by the supplier, albeit it's now kind of brokered or managed via the registration service, and we'll come on to look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. And then service providers still have the right or ability to choose to accept or reject an appointment. So in terms of the kind of key fundamentals, in terms of a supplier choosing who his agents are and initiating the appointment process, and an agent then accepting or rejecting that, though that sort of those key underlying principles are not changed. I think I think the difference is that you've got now the registration service that's sort of sitting between the supplier and the service providers, managing or more proactively managing the process. The expectation is that suppliers would initiate the service provider appointment alongside a switch request, or at the end of an objection period. Effectively, I think what we're saying is that it would be in advance of SSD, depending on what each supplier thought was the best or most efficient process for them. But I think, as I say, effectively prior to a site reaching SSD. However, that having been said, the process does actually also allow for both on the day and retrospective appointment of service providers, if required. So, for example, if I'm acquiring a site today, and for some reason my initial service provider appointment gets rejected or fails to complete successfully for whatever reason, I can, after the fact, retrospectively backdate the service appointment back to my SSD. And in fact, that, as we'll come on to talk about in a minute, that is in the MHHS world, there's no concept of having gaps. So in those scenarios where I had a delayed appointment, I would the validation of the registration system would effectively force me to go back and fill that gap. The registration service will have functionality to firstly, to do some upfront checks to ensure that the service provider that's being appointed to an MPAN is appropriate. So, for example, it wouldn't, is the service provider capable of servicing my particular connection type, or operating in the market segment of my MPAN. There is some special logic, and again we'll talk about this in a lot more detail in the session on Friday. But there is some special provisions to allow for a change of connection type or a change in market segment, and that's covered in BP 11, A and B, but we'll cover that in a lot more detail on Friday. So it's really to allow for a scenario where I want to appoint agents in anticipation of the fact that the market segment or the connection type might be changing. As I mentioned, the registration service will seek to prevent gaps in service provider appointment for any given period of supply. So hence the requirement to allow for that retrospective appointment. Effectively, the registration service will manage a queue of prospective appointments, and it will automatically expire or lapse appointments that they can't then be successfully matched to a switch request. And the registration service will also issue reminder notifications to suppliers in certain circumstances, for example, where there's a missing service provider appointment, or instances where the registration service believes that the data is misaligned. So again, that sort of links into this change of connection type market segment process, where I might have completed one part of the process but not another. But again, we'll cover that in a lot more detail on Friday. I think the other big thing to call out around this process is that de-appointment is now effectively completely automated and managed by the registration service. So the registration service will automatically de-appoint service providers either off the back of a successful change of supplier. Obviously, the appointment of a new service provider, or in the case of a disconnection, then the registration service will manage the closing off or de-appointment of the old service provider. There's no longer a requirement for the supplier to do that. And I think the other sort of key change here is that in the UMS world, I think currently there's no requirement to effectively appoint a metering service at the moment. I think it's effectively sort of automatically assigned or defaulted, but in the MHHS world, suppliers now must formally appoint a metering service for UMS MPANs. If we have a look at sort of the happy path for service provider appointments, I think when the process map first comes up, it does usually trigger a sharp inhaling of breath, but I kind of wanted to go through it schematically, so just to try and illustrate that perhaps it's not as scary as it might appear at first sight. So effectively, we have interface the supplier in anticipation of acquiring a site for a particular SSD would request a service provider appointment via the registration service. And apologies, there's a little typo here. That would be interface 31 going out and an interface 32 coming back. So supplier would request appointment of a metering service or a data service. As we said, the registration service would do some initial validation around that to check to check that it was sort of valid for the MPANs market segment and connection, and then either send an acceptance or a rejection back to the supplier. Assuming it was accepted, the registration service would then pass that appointment request onto the new service provider via a pub 33, and the service provider then either the metering service or the data service responds back using interface pub 34, responds back to the registration service. Again, that could be with an accept or a reject, and that outcome is then fed back on a pub 35 back to the supplier. So for example, if the service provider was rejecting the request, effectively the process would stop at that point. Supplier requests it via registration, service provider rejects it for whatever reason, and then sends that response back to the supplier. And if it were a rejection, then obviously the supplier would seek to resolve that issue, invalid contract code or whatever, and then resubmit his request. If we assume that was actually a successful an acceptance, what would happen then is the registration service would also send a notification to the old service provider, let's say the metering service, and that would act as a trigger then to send, in certain circumstances, the metering technical details from let's say the old metering service to the new metering service. I think that's principally it's more of an issue in the advanced space, where we still have some kind of movement of data between individual service providers. Less important in the smart space, because obviously all the meter technical details are held by the registration service. This appointment would then effectively sit in the prospective appointment would then effectively sit in a queue, if you like, waiting for SSD to be reached, and for the registration service to receive that secured active notification from the CSS. And once that had happened, it would effectively marry up that secured active with the appointment request, and issue a pub 36 out to both the new supplier and the service provider. And the pub 36 is really is the message, the flow that you can hang your hat on to say, yes, I'm, from an agent's service provider's perspective, yes, I'm definitely appointed now, and similarly from a supplier's perspective, yes, that appointment request has gone active. So pub 36 is that formal notification that an appointment has come into effect. And then obviously, as we said, the registration service would then manage de-appointment pub 37 to the outgoing service provider, and the registration service just copies that to the old supplier, just as confirmation to say, yes, I've de-appointed your old provider for you. So that is really the kind of, diagrammatically, that's the kind of flow. That's the kind of flow that we've got. The sort of initial request for appointment from the supplier, the acceptance or the rejection from the service provider, the feedback of that of that acceptance or rejection to the requesting supplier, and then this wait period until SSD is reached. In cases of, as we spoke about, on the day or retro, then effectively there is no wait period, because the registration service would effectively issue this flow immediately. But in the case of an upcoming switch, once it had received its secured active notification, marries that up with an appointment request, and then issues the pub 36 to say, yes, this appointment has gone into effect, and then obviously, as we said, the corresponding de-appointment notifications. So if we have a look and see what that looks like on the process map, as you can see, that sort of it translates to a little bit more complexity on the actual process map. So the area that we sort of need to concern ourselves with in the first instance is this sort of unshaded block here. And I'll just grab a mouthful of water, and then I'll walk through the individual steps. Okay. So if we come up here, again, in terms of participants, we've got the supplier, either the prospective, or it could be the incumbent supplier, because if we're in a change of agent, or change of service provider type scenario, then we'd be effectively following the exact same process. So got the prospective supplier, the registration service, obviously the DIP in the middle, and again, you'll notice once you start looking at these process maps, the DIP is always, or DIP activity is always shown in blue, just to try and help with that differentiation. And the one I think that we were planning to walk through was a metering service. So we've got new metering service, old metering service, newer existing data service, and the outgoing supplier and the LDSO. But let's quickly walk through. So
you might need to zoom in a little bit, Sean. Oh, right, okay.
No worries. Yeah, I'm going. Okay, so as we said, the supplier would be determining, possibly off the back of the interface 02, or other factors, if he's doing a change of agent. But effectively, the supplier determines the metering or data service that he wants to appoint, and then sends that, as we saw, sends that request on an interface 31 via the DIP into the registration service. At which point the registration service would do some initial, as we said, validation at that point. And I think at this stage it's pretty light touch, effectively just saying, is the service provider, is the service provider compatible with the MPAN that is being appointed to, in terms of I don't want to appoint an advanced metering service to a smart or traditional site. Then the registration service would then send an outcome response, either an acceptance or a rejection, back up to the supplier. As we said earlier on, if that was a rejection, then obviously the supplier would look at the rejection reason, address the fundamental issues, and then re-trigger the process. In the case that the service provider, if it passes for that registration validation, the registration service will then forward that request, as we said, using interface 33 onto the incoming service provider. And again, as we alluded to before, that incoming service provider makes a decision as to whether he's happy to accept the appointment or not. Is it do I have a contract with the supplier? Is it in the right area? Have I used the right contract codes, etc., etc. And he will accept or reject that proposed appointment request and send that back using interface 34 back through to the registration service. at this point, and again, you probably want to spend some time looking at these diagrams, you know, in a bit more detail offline. But if you remember, we said that that the outcome of that sort of agent decision to accept the appointment or not flowed back to the supplier, and that's what this leg here is showing. So we come down here, so we're effectively saying all responses could be an acceptance, could be a rejection. All responses flow then back to the supplier. And again, if it was a rejection, I'd resolve the underlying reason and restart the process. If we assume that we were successful, effectively what happens then is that the registration service would make a decision to say, well, is this a same day or retro appointment, in which case I can effectively process that immediately. And at that point, effectively, it goes to triggering out the interface 36, both to the new supplier, both to the new metering service and the old supplier, and the supplier. So yeah, apologies. So if it's same day or retro, then I don't need to wait for anything. You know, I don't need to wait for anything. I already know that the supplier is the supplier. I don't need to match it up with anything. So I can effectively issue the 36 to the supplier and the incoming metering service. If it's a prospective appointment, so again, if we talked about doing it, setting these appointments up in anticipation, perhaps setting these appointments up today in anticipation of an SSD at some point next week, then the appointment would effectively be held in a queue, and the registration system would effectively cycle those prospective appointments around, waiting to be able to match it up with a secured active that came in from CSS. So that's what what these two boxes are trying to denote. Is the process, the daily processing of this queue. And again, there's a number of outcomes at this point. Once if we sort of take the happy path to begin with, so the secured active has come in, I can marry that up with I'm able to marry that up with a prospective appointment, and then effectively, as we said, what would happen then would be that I would trigger off my interface 36, both to the incoming service provider and the supplier, effectively saying, yeah, this proposed appointment has gone, has become active. And that would, as we said, that would also then trigger the de-appointment notification to the appropriate supplier and the outgoing service provider. And then there will be cases, let's say the switch. Let's say the switch had got objected. To, so supplier has set up a prospective appointments, but the switch got objected to, or the customer's cancelled. What would happen would be that those once the start date of once the appointment start date or proposed appointment start date had been reached, the registration service would say, well, okay, I'm now past the point that this appointment was supposed to start. I haven't been able to match it up with a secured active for the same supplier and the same date. Therefore, this appointment can't go anywhere now. It's effectively timed out, and that's where you would get this lapsed notification to say, effectively, you did have an appointment sitting in the queue, but it's run out of time. There's no secured actives been received. Therefore, an interface 35 is sent out to the supplier, effectively saying, and also to the incoming service provider, effectively saying this appointment's lapsed. It's died. It's not progressing. Like I say, I think obviously participants will want to take these, will want to take these diagrams and scrutinize them, go through them in a lot more detail than we can do today. But if we, alongside the main processing, if you like, of the main processing of the appointment by the registration service, behind the scenes there is also a notification that's gone out to the old metering service, in order to tell him, hey, there's party B, metering service B, has got a prospective appointment for this MPAN. Therefore, can you send on the meter technical details? So that's what's sort of happening here. And as I said, I think that's more important in where I've got a traditional or advanced meter, because I need more information around the metering than is held in the registration service. So I need register mappings, let's say, or more detailed technical information about the advanced meter in terms of how do I access it, passwords, and communication addresses and things like that, which are not stored in the registration service. Therefore, sort of need to be exchanged between metering services. And I think that we have the sort of that would happen for all prospective. That exchange of information would happen for all prospective appointments, and then there's an expectation on the receiving party that should that appointment not go ahead for whatever reason, then obviously they would need to dispose of the data that they no longer required, in line with people's general GDPR type policies. So the information's always exchanged with an incoming or a prospective metering service, and that's the processes that are happening here. So that would be an exchange of 149 150 in the case of a trad meter, or a 268 in the case of an advanced meter. And then obviously the metering service, as is the case today, the metering service, once in receipt of that metering data, would flow it on to both the supplier and the data service, in exactly the same way as the convention works today. So yeah, I appreciate. I'd say I think participants will want to sort of take their own time to step through these processes. but hopefully we've managed to get across the gist of how that process is operating. And it is very much, as we said, it's sort of that 3 or 4 stage approach. Supplier requests appointment via registration passes that request on to the agent. If it's accepted, the registration service tells the outgoing agent to forward on meter technical details, and then holds the appointment in a queue until SSD is reached, and then once SSD is reached, issues out the 36 to say yes, this appointment's become effective, and alongside that the 37 into pub 37 to say the outgoing agent is de-appointed. So hopefully we've managed to land the basics in what is when you look at it like this, a complicated process, but hopefully we managed to deconstruct that down for you. Obviously you want to spend some more time looking at this in detail yourselves. I think the only thing that I would add at this point is that for smart and for smart or for smart meters, alongside once the appointment has been confirmed, there is a process to then effectively update CSS and DCC as to who the new agents are, primarily who the MDR is, basically who is the entity that now has the right to access the smart meter. This, I think, might be a good point to switch. Yeah, so I think this will utilize the whole set of existing ERDA interfaces that cover this, and we'll be reusing those interfaces. I'm guessing you guys perhaps know a lot more about these than we do on the program even, but there is an interface that flows currently from registration to CSS to DCC, to effectively let DCC know who the current data collector is, or who the current agents are, and that those existing interfaces will be reused to allow registration service to tell these parties this is the new data service and this is the new MDR. The exact sort of low level detailed design around that change is still ongoing, and that's covered off in Rec Change 44 for those that are interested to go and have a nosy at that. But effectively, all we're really doing is reusing this existing interface to tell DCC who the appointed MDR is. I'll just quickly call out, I think several participants have asked whether it would be possible to get an update from the registration service when that sort of handshaking with DCC had completed. I think we're mindful of that, and I think some of the diagrams perhaps reflect that at the moment, or certainly make a reference to it. Obviously, we would need to revisit that and understand how useful that is once the changes around R44 are known at the lower level. So if we have a quick look at that map. Nope. Here we go. Yeah. So again, this is it's a relatively straightforward daisy chain of information, really, and like I say, this is using the existing ERDA, ERDA mechanisms. So effectively, once the registration service has said yes, this service provider is now appointed, it would trigger an update through to CSS to say here are the new agents, and that then flows on to the DCC, who to make them aware. And I think this is, and here we're talking about, this is where we're talking about some potential feedback, either to the data service or to other participants if they're also interested. But that is sort of dependent on some outstanding design decisions around exactly how this response is going to work. So I think I'll leave that there if I can. So I think if I can quickly cover changes to existing service appointments and requests, and then I might be opportune to take a very quick 5-minute breather. So within the MHHS design, there's no appointment cancellation mechanism per se. So in situations where perhaps I wanted to change an existing proposed appointment, I don't know, either wanted to change the date, or I wanted to change some facet of the appointment, where that had already been accepted by the service provider. Effectively, what I would do is to effectively just reissue a new appointment, and what the registration system will effectively do is identify what is the most recent, recently accepted appointment for this MPAN, and use that. So as I said, in scenarios whereby I'm wanting to change a prospective appointment that's already been accepted by the agent, I'd effectively just reissue a new appointment request with amended details, and the registration service will make sure that it matches that up with the latest appointment issued by the supplier, and then it will lapse. Suppliers will get a lapse notification for any previous appointments. Yeah, and effectively, yeah, the cutoff for that process is effectively any point up until that prospective appointment goes live. So effectively, gate closure on the day before SSD. Any prospective appointments that don't, that can't be matched to a secure active, as we said before. Let's say the switch has been objected to, or the customer's cancelled it. Effectively, the registration service will automatically mop those up. So if it gets to an appointment start date and it hasn't been able to successfully marry it up with a secured active request, then the registration service will effectively lapse and tidy those appointments up, and the supplier will effectively get a lapse notification via interface 35 saying, I could never marry this proposed appointment up to a switch, therefore I'm killing it off. When it comes to making changes to appointments that are already active, so effectively where I've already the service provider is already appointed, then again we would need to follow the process, change of existing service provider process, which we'll have a brief look at in a moment. But effectively, it's a rerun of the same. I have to reissue. It's a rerun of the same. It's a rerun of the normal appointment process. So supplier would have to reissue his interface 31, get a 32 back. The agent or the service provider would, reassess that change. Whether it changing contract reference or changing some aspect of the service, and accept or reject that back. I think the big sort of difference to the BAU process is that that would just effectively, the process would stop at the pub 35 point. I wouldn't get a new pub 36 if that makes sense. So if we quickly look at that on here. Sorry, change of existing service appointment details. So this is the exact same process as we walk through for the sort of standard appointment. I send a 31, or supplier sends a 31 into registration. A registration responds back on a 32, either saying yes, I accept that, everything matches up, it's valid, the proposed service provider is valid for this MPAN, or sends a rejection. If it is an acceptance, then that request is forwarded on to the existing service provider. Again, existing service provider makes some determines whether he's happy with the nature of the change, and responds back to the registration service, and the outcome of that is then sent back to the supplier on pub 35, and assuming that's an acceptance or rejection, actually at that point the process effectively ends. So yes, the change has been made, and I won't get a new 30. I won't get a new 36. It'll just stop at the acceptance of the change. I think this leg here is just recognizing that change might be to change the MDR, to change from MDRA to MDRB. So if it were a change of MDR, obviously I'd have to go and update CSS and the DCC as well to put the access controls in place for the new MDR. So I'm conscious we've rattled through a lot so far. We're about on time, so I think we're about halfway through. So if people don't mind, we'll take a very quick 5 minute break. What time are we now? Dead on 10 past. So if we come back at maybe quarter past 11, and then we'll quickly walk through the last couple of processes that we've got, and then obviously get into the questions. So yeah, if participants want to sort of reconvene in a quarter past, 5 minutes, that would be great. Okay, I think I'll make it sort of 1:15-ish, but yeah, my watch. Just, I'm sure you'll all be sick of the sound of my voice by the end of the 2 hours, but thanks for that. Just allows me to have a little bit of a breather. So I perhaps should have, I think, just wanted to quickly cover what we call linked or grouped MPANs, and the MHHS design actually contains new functionality for effectively service provider auto alignment. So I think this was much discussed within the work groups, and I think it was decided that this is actually there are currently sort of documented rules around. Currently, there are documented rules around when MPANs should have the same agents, particularly metering service, but I think also in some instances data service or DC, when they should have the same service provider assigned to them. To cut a long story short, the working group decided that it would be the right thing to automate this functionality within the registration service. So when we talked about linked or grouped MPANs, we're primarily talking about two types of MPAN. There's the related MPANs, which we all know and love, and then also I believe a change that's just recently gone through to allow the linking of related import and export MPANs. So both of these, both of these types of MPAN, in the MHHS world, it'll only be possible for suppliers to initiate the service appointment process on either the primary MPAN or the linked import MPAN. And then effectively what will happen is that the service provider, as part of his interface 33 notification, will effectively be made aware that this is a linked MPAN and these are the other MPANs associated with it, and effectively acceptance of that initial appointment request is effectively acceptance, will be deemed as acceptance for all of the MPANs in the group. So the primary MPAN or the linked import MPAN will effectively progress through the process exactly as we've just talked it through. But then at the end, once the at the end of the process, once the interface 36 is kicked out, effectively once the appointment becomes effective, what will happen is that interface 36 messages will also be issued, and corresponding de-appointment messages will be issued for all of the MPANs in the related groups, or the secondary MPANs, or for the linked export. At the moment, the current design is that the related MPANs are maintained using the existing process, which I think is using the D386. A number of pies have suggested that this might be a possible candidate for replacing the 386 with an interaction over the DIP. But that's not in the current design, but it's a potential CR. Moving forward. But as things stand, the nature of the related MPANs would be managed, linked and delinked in exactly the same way as they are currently using the 386. And I believe the proposal for linking and delinking import and export MPANs, that relationship is maintained via interaction with the LDSO or the DNO. And again, we've raised the possibility with RETCO of that possibly being done via an SDEP query in the future. But that's a decision for RETCO as to whether they want to progress with that. So I think I think the important thing here is that for any linked MPAN, it'll only be the primary or the import on which you'll be able to initiate the service provider appointment, and then in the case of that successfully making it through the process, all the associated MPANs will move along, alongside it. Break. We've already done that one. Okay, next process we wanted to walk through was the so we've done our cars, we've done our appointed, we've appointed our agents. Now we wanted to talk through the exchange of meter readings following a change of supplier, but also I think this process also applies effectively if I was doing a change of data service. And again, there's some sort of high level, I don't know, headlines to perhaps bear in mind before we look at the process in detail. I think for smart and advanced, for both smart and advanced meters, there is the expectation that for the vast majority of meters, in the vast majority of cases, all parties will have access to actual data from the meter, and this is the kind of, this should be the default, the default position is that each party will be, as they do currently, each party will attempt to access the meter to get that midnight reading, or to pull the data that they need. And that, in the vast majority of cases, each party will have access to that data, and will be able to use the actual data recovered from the meter. I think we do have a process of sharing. We have a process of sharing that reading data, which we'll look at in a moment, and that the purpose of sharing that data is really to allow parties to validate the data that they've received, if they choose. So, do the readings that I've got marry up with the readings that the old supplier has taken, or do the readings I have marry up with the readings that my SDS have got? But also to try and preempt in the small, what we hope will be the small minority of cases where actual data is not available for whatever reason, either transiently or longer term, but where actual data isn't available, it effectively provides visibility to all parties of what the transfer readings should be, without the need to necessarily go through a request process. I think, again, this process was subject to a lot of conversation and discussion in the work groups, and I think, again, what I'd urge participants to sort of bear in mind is that, at the end of the day, there's no process that can completely replace or completely mitigate either the need for the D300 process to agree reads, or to actually, in certain circumstances, speak directly to your your partner service provider, or to the to the other supplier involved in the transfer. So, as we said, the kind of the process assumes that in the vast majority, in the overwhelming majority of cases, actual data is available. In cases where actual data isn't available, then effectively it will be the outgoing SDS who will provide a cumulative estimate, and share that with the other parties, that will be the case. You'd either provide a cumulative estimate in the case of smart meter, or register readings in the case of a traditional site. And similarly, the outgoing supplier, again, I think here, in particularly in the case of a smart meter, the outgoing supplier would estimate the billing or tariff registers and share those with the incoming supplier, in a very similar way to as what takes place today. A decision was taken that we would only utilize customer own reads for traditional meters. So again, we'll look at that on the process in a moment. As a kind of general rule of thumb, I think this is something to bear in mind across the board, really, for all processes, and we'll certainly be covering it on the session on Friday when we do meter exchanges and things as well. But as a kind of general rule of thumb, smart or cumulative readings are exchanged over the DIP using interface publication 41, and traditional register readings, traditional readings for traditional meters or register readings are exchanged using a D10. We'll look at this in a bit more detail on the map, but broadly speaking, the existing D300 process will be used exactly as it is today to resolve sort of issues or queries around transfer readings, but the principles, the principles are the same. The suppliers agree the readings with each other, and the supplier notifies their respective partner data service. And a data service is only taking instruction about an agreed read from his partner supplier. So again, not too dissimilar to the way things work today. Apologies, I think this is another somewhat scary process where I can find it at first sight. Yeah. Where do we start? Right. So as you can see, the process is sort of chunked up into we've sort of chunked the process up into stages or elements, if you like. In terms of these red bars at the top, and that's what these red lines denoting these sort of the separation of these different elements. We've not done that on all the process maps, but I think on some of them it certainly helps with trying to digest what's going on. So the first stage is effectively completion of the service provider appointment process. So effectively, all of these, you can see that we've got the pub 36 going there to the incoming data service of the incoming supplier, and here a hopefully perhaps not a de-appointment here, a de-appointment coming out here to the outgoing data service, and the outgoing should also show going to the outgoing supplier there. Unfortunately, that's a bit of a miss. And as we said, each party, and I think that's what this sort of narrow lane is trying to denote here, is effectively each party, as they do at the moment, will attempt to access the meter and recover their own data in exactly the way that they do at the moment. And so this process is more a kind of, as we said, for the vast majority of cases for smart meters, that will be the tick in that'll be the tick in the box. I think the purpose of this process really is to, as we've sort of said here, is to have a handshake between participants that, yes, we've all got a reading and it matches up. So if we perhaps start with the outgoing supplier, so he's effectively had his de-appointment notification. He's then going to attempt to access the meter, And in cases where he recovers actual data, effectively the expectation is that, you know, subject to perhaps doing a double check with what he gets from his SDS or from his data service, he'll go on and bill out to that final data that he's recovered. In the absence of being able to access data, so if there's a transient or longer term issue with trying to access the meter, then he would be able to rely on an estimate from his outgoing SDS. And I say an estimate, actually that could also be an actual read. So if for whatever reason the outgoing supplier's attempt to access the meter failed for whatever reason, but the outgoing SDS was able to access the meter, he would be sending that actual those actual readings through to the old supplier. And again, that would allow him then to complete his final billing. If this were an estimate, because neither party were able to access actual data, then, as we said, the outgoing supplier would estimate register readings and then forward those on using a D10 to the old supplier, so that he had an awareness of what the tariff level readings were like. And I think this is akin to the processing that happens today. If for any reason the old supplier is uncomfortable, his data doesn't match the SDS data, or if he's uncomfortable or any issue with the readings he's recovered, then he would trigger the D300 process to say to the incoming supplier, hey, what readings have you got? Are we in line? And the BAU process of agreeing a read. So hopefully that covers sort of what's happening in terms of the outgoing supplier and smart. If we come then to the outgoing data service, as we said, if he's got access to actual data, then he'll send that through to the old supplier, as we said, but he'll also send it on to the incoming data service and the incoming supplier. So the outgoing data service sends that cumulative read through to the incoming data service and the incoming supplier, and then that would allow them again to compare that with any data that they had received, assuming that the incoming data service is happy. He'd then go on and start his BAU processing. And then, as we said, in the case that neither of these parties have been able to access actual data, then after a period of 5 days, during which I may or may not have been attempting to retry and recontact the meter, but effectively, if I've gone 5 days after the SSD and I still don't have any actual data, then that's when, as we said, the outgoing SDS would issue an estimate, again sent to the old supplier and the incoming SDS and the incoming supplier. I think then probably if we look at the new supplier, I think he's probably got the I don't know, he's really got the task of being in possession of possibly the most data. So he will have potentially recovered his own copy of his own copy of the actual data, and or he would have received data from his own SDS or from the outgoing SDS. Again, he may or may not have the register level readings from the supplier, and effectively the new supplier, will have to come to some decision making about based on all the data that he's got as to, okay, what is the, what reads am I starting from? And now, in theory, all of these would match up and would tally up. They all agree. They're all in broad agreement with each other, and there's no issue. We carry on and start billing. If there was any discrepancy or any concern around, the alignment of these readings, then that's when you go into the D300 process to contact the other supplier and then try and figure out what's happening with the data. So that's sort of how things work for a smart meter. So hopefully that's not. I'd say hopefully it's not too dissimilar from effectively what happens today. Then thinking about traditional meters, as we said, I think there could still be a large number of trad meters out there, particularly when we perhaps at the point of go live. We know about a third of customers end up providing a COR, so we do need to. We felt we needed to accommodate a COR in the process for trad meters, and again, this would work by effectively the convention is the incoming supplier attempts to obtain that read. So he'd get it, his customer, he acquires a customer own read. He would swap that reading using a D10 with the old supplier, who would then say, yes, yes, that tallies up with what with my meter read history or my billing history, and they'd send an acceptance back, or they would send a rejection back saying, nah, doesn't tally with what I've got, in which case effectively the COR dies at that point, but effectively we're going to end up in a D3. We're probably going to end up in a D300 process. If the old supplier is happy with the reading, he feeds that back to the incoming supplier, as we said, and he also sends it on to his data service to say, hey, we've got this COR, and please feed that into your process for establishing an endpoint. Again, I think just for the outgoing SDS would then reissue that just as a kind of formal handshake to say, this is the reading this is the reading I'm going to close off settlements for the old supplier, and he just confirms that reading then back both to the old supplier, and then the incoming SDS and the incoming supplier. And again, really, either everyone's happy with that read. It sort of matches up with the COR, matches up with historic billing. Great. Or a party will be unhappy, or will have an issue with the read, in which case we go into the D300 process to discuss what to do, to agree a read, effectively. So, and again, I think just as a, I don't know whether this has been called out, but in terms of the diagram convention, where we have used, where deflows are reused in the various processes, they're always sort of marked up in this orangey color. But obviously, as we're talking about traditional meters here, traditional meter readings would always be exchanged using a D10 rather than a interface 41, which is just for smart reads. Very quickly looking at the process for advanced. Looking for the process for advanced meters, I think there's not as much. I think again, based on conversations within the work group, there's not as much interaction between the outgoing and incoming data services, and effectively what would happen is that the outgoing advanced data service will attempt to access the meter. If he's got data available, great. He'll flow that data onto the supplier and go about finalizing the settlement position for that MPAN. Where he doesn't have access to actual data, he'll just go ahead and estimate. And again, that will flow that estimate onto the old supplier. And similarly, you've got a similar sort of process happening on the new SDS new supplier side, where he's attempting to access the meter. He's either successful, in which case he's got actual data, great. There are some circumstances where certain types of meters where you might need to arrange for an on-site visit to physically download something from the meter, and he's also got the ability to effectively request historic consumption information via the DIP, so he can get the consumption history back for that MPAN, and again he'd flow that information onto the new supplier to say this is our start position. There is don't plan on really going through this in a huge amount of detail, but effectively this business process map 3D is effectively the agreed read process, or actually a kind of streamlined version of it. I think the main takeaway message here really is that process isn't changing, and you'll agree we'll follow the normal rules and escalations and things that happen with the D300 process, and until such point as a read is agreed. And once a read's agreed, each supplier will then notify his respective SDS that, hey, this is the read that we've agreed, and this is where you need to start and end end. So again, you can have a browser this offline, but it's effectively saying it's the existing D300 process, uber simplified. Appreciate there's escalation processes and dispute processes and things. Those are not, we made no apology about not trying to remap the D300 process. It's really just for context. Okay, we're almost there, guys. We're almost there. So I think the last bit that we wanted to go through, and again, this is mega easy, really. Is supplier updates into the registration service. Effectively, the supplier is able to maintain these sort of 4 or 5 different data items within the registration service. So obviously consent granularity. Does the customer, what's the level of access by the customers consented to. IHD information, and I think this is sort of connected to primarily first install of a smart meter, I think. The DCC enrolment status of an MPAN or a meter, and the SMSO, if I think this relates to services provided around some subset of SMETS 1 meters, but effectively these are the data items, and I think each of these effectively comes with an effective from date. But so these are the data elements that a supplier can maintain within the registration service. We're still having some discussions internally about whether there's a need to maintain SSC profile class. Now, again, I think probably be covered in the settlements session, but these sort of data items are sort of effectively redundant apart from use with sort of multi-rate traditional meters. So we're still sort of I think the design team is still sort of trying to understand whether there would be a need to maintain those data items. I don't know, some kind of trad to trad exchange. We don't know, but that's still under active discussion. But effectively, these are the main data items that a supplier can maintain. And it's a relatively straightforward two-step process, really. The supplier issues an interface 25 into the DIP. That's received by the registration service as a pub 25. Registration service will validate that change. Is the consent, does the consent match with the segment? Is my start date appropriate for the change? And then we'll either accept or reject that change back using interface 26 into the DIP and pub 26 out to the supplier with the response. Again, there is a process map that covers all of this off. I wasn't planning on going through it because it literally is that two-step. That two-step sort of interaction of sending an interface to, here's the new value for these things and the new effective date, and then a response back. And again, you can participants can have a look at in the interface document as to as to the exact data items that are exchanged with each of those. But I think it's effectively a value and an effective from date for each. I just wanted to call out as well at this point that yes, that the supplier effectively also does maintain the domestic premise indicator. However, this will effectively be done via CSS. So I think at the moment it's sort of set on initial registration, and I think there is the ability then to change that mid period of supply. So that would be done. That any kind of change to the domestic premise indicator would be done via the CSS process, CSS interfaces, and effectively successful updates would then be passed into the registration service from CSS, and then the registration service would issue those updates out to the MHHS participants. So again, suppliers would get looped in on that as a kind of belt and braces. Yes, the change that you've made with CSS has now fed its way through the pipe work, and here's your confirmation that it's been that it's fed through to the MHHS world, if you like. So I think I don't know, it's more by luck than design. I think that sort of wraps things up. I'll just perhaps call out call out a couple of links, and again, I'm sure these slides will be available for you to get the links. But all of the MPAN ownership related documentation, so all the process maps, business process descriptions and things associated with all of the processes we've gone through today, are in a special sort of MPAN ownership folder, if you like, on the program website. I'd also urge people to have a look in the supporting documentation folder around the business requirements, both for the registration service, but we've actually also done sort of high-level requirements for other participants as well, so suppliers and LDSOs. So that might also be useful for people to have a look at. Obviously, we don't know how your systems will operate, but we have sort of got requirements in terms of, you should be able to send interface X and receive, publication Y, and, validate data item Z. So having a look through those requirements, I think, hopefully they will be useful. As I mentioned earlier on, here's the link to the sort of high-level overview on interfaces. I think there's also some deep dives, I think, later this week on the interface stuff. But if you're just wanting a kind of high level, this is kind of how the messages flow and how the interfaces are structured, then I'd certainly recommend that. And then obviously, do email us at either at the design mailbox or the PPC mailbox if there's any queries. So I think I'll wrap it up there, and that leaves us with about 10 minutes on questions. So I don't know, is it Amity?
Yes. Amity
Morning,
here.
mate.
So we've had a lot of questions coming through. Obviously, we've only got less than 10 minutes now. So we'll go through the most upvoted ones, and then highlight some of the other themes, but we'll be able to get answers to these questions after today. The most upvoted one is, can we please get a list of deflows which will be discontinued and what they will be replaced with, either interfaces or publications?
So the plan is to publish that. We've got a draft already. We're just sort of doing a belt and braces check of it and giving it a polish up, but that'll be published. I think the idea is that we'll send the link out in the clock on Thursday, and that'll be effectively a list of all the existing data flows, whether they're staying or going, and if they're going, what sort of MHHS interface publication replaces them. So if you keep an eye out for the clock or email on Thursday, there should be a link in there to that document.
Great, thanks. The second one is, and I'm assuming this is what you've actually got up on the screen at the moment, but can we please have a link to the hour-long interface video that was mentioned on the call?
Yeah, so that's this one. I don't know, have we got yeah, I don't know whether we've got a chat or anything today, have we? I don't know.
No, we don't have a chat today, but we'll be able to circulate that.
Yeah, great.
Great. On the third question that we've got, on previous sessions, we were told that Q&As raised on the design playback sessions will be published on SharePoint. Where exactly have these been saved?
I know that they. I think there's. I don't know that they were going. I think some have been. There is an FAQ section on the collaboration base. So and I know some responses have been put there. I think there's also perhaps a collating and again a bit of a collating and polishing exercise going on. But if you leave that one with us, I'm sure we'll try and we'll include something in the clock as well.
Sean, sorry, I can give an answer on this one. Kevin Redmond from the PPC team. Yes, that is correct. We are collating the questions. The first batch of questions and answers have gone up onto the collaboration base. And Sean, you are correct. The link to that will be issued in the clock later on this afternoon. There's obviously a collation and cleaning up exercise going on, but over the next few weeks, that Q&A document will expand greatly.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Then the next question is, who will tell the supplier that an MPAN is MHHS migrated upon COS? Will this be a CSS via a change to one of their interfaces published on EES, for example?
So I think we've the original. So I think transition is something that we still is actively under discussion and design at the moment. I think originally the idea was to sort of publish a transition process and transition solution as alongside the wider design. I think unfortunately timescales and things just haven't allowed for that. So the transition process is under active. We're actively talking about it now as a design team and a program, and yes, there will need to be markers and flags, and I think towards the middle or back end of September, we'll be in a position to publish the actual sort of transition process. So how do I transition, and to your point, what flags will be available where, to tell me whether something has or hasn't moved previously into the MHHS world. So all the transition stuff and how that will happen is still under active discussion by the team, and I think that will start coming out for discussion and consultation, middle to end of September time, I would imagine.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got another question is, how much consideration has been given to the unhappy paths? PBO2 is incredibly complex, and there are now many more potential failure points.
BPO2, there are, well, I suppose, yes, there is. I suppose by inserting the registration system as a broker in the by inserting the registration system as a broker, yes, I am effectively, creating more interactions. Whether that has that got the potential to result in more exceptions? I'm not sure. I'm not necessarily sure it does. If the data's set correctly, then it should fly through that process, and if data's set incorrectly, then it would be rejected, whether that's via the registration service or the agent. So yes, there's certainly more stages and more interactions. Whether it doesn't necessarily mean that automatically leads to an increase in exceptions. I think in terms of the kind of insertion of the registration system in that process, I mean that sort of links back to the TOM design and some of the early consultation and design work. That's effectively a concept that the program team inherited, and there was much discussion about it within the work groups and things, but it kind of goes with the territory in terms of if I want to make the registration system the manager or guardian of this data, then unfortunately it's got to be inserted in the process.
Great, thank you. The next one is, how will linked import-export MPANs work for non-domestic customers with more than one import MPANs on site? Many to many import-export relationships / records. Yeah,
so again, I can't remember the change request off the top of my head, but there was a change request that is recently gone through industry change request that's recently gone through the process that effectively introduces 2 new fields. So to be able to link MPANs, to link these import-export MPANs, but the linkage would only be made in where it was appropriate to do so. So I'm thinking about where I've got, I don't know, where it's a domestic site, or I've got a single meter recording import and export. I think those advanced type scenarios where I've got standalone export MPANs, those wouldn't be linked, and therefore wouldn't necessarily be subject to the auto alignment. I think if you want to take an action, what we can do is to describe the exact scenarios when we anticipate things would be linked, and when they wouldn't be. But we're not saying that all import-export MPANs would be linked. Certainly there are some where it's not appropriate they're linked, that they are separate independent meter points, therefore they wouldn't be linked, and if they're not linked they wouldn't be subject to the auto alignment.
Brilliant, Sean. I'm conscious of time. We've got a final comment there around our use of a gendered language, which is feedback we received before, and we'll make sure that we make sure that that's feedback that's given across the program as well. But yes, I'm conscious of time, so I think we'll leave it there. As we said, we will communicate our answers to as many of these questions as we can, as we've been doing for the previous sessions as well, and we'll communicate that out.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you everyone. Thanks for putting the time in and listening to me rattle on for 2 hours. Hopefully it has been useful for you, and like I say, do look through the resources and come back to us if you've got any